Hello, now we're ready for part 2 of our artist talks today here at Bainbridge Arts and Crafts. It's my pleasure to introduce a young woman, very talented, named Janelle Abbott, who's here to talk about her work using reclaimed materials and a little bit of performance, and, a lot of color, and we're very happy to have you. Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. My name's Janelle Abbott. I grew up in Kenmore, Washington, just north of Lake Washington, and my parents owned a clothing manufacturing company when I was a kid. It's called Amanda Gray, if anyone remembers it. It was like 10-cell, piece-dyed, like layerable pieces, very mid-90s school teacher vibe. And I was homeschooled through 9th grade, so I spent a lot of time at the warehouse, hanging out and just getting to explore and play. And the trash cans around the office and the factory were kind of my resource bin. I would pull a lot of scraps out and make little dolls, and I'd try to make things to sell to the employees, and sometimes that didn't work out so well because I was like cutting holes in soda cans to make piggy banks, but I was like cutting my fingers, and I had a very imaginative and fun childhood, and I got to learn how to sew at a very young age. And since my mom, she's a designer, my dad, he ran the business, but they both gave me a lot of agency to play with the way that I dressed and play with my own clothes. I cut up clothes and sewed them back together in different ways and painted on my clothing, which felt very unique. It inspired some of my friends in a bad way, and they ended up getting in trouble with their parents for messing around with their clothes. But that's really the foundation upon which I built my creative life and my career today. I ended up going to Parsons School of Design, where I studied fashion design. And my parents didn't necessarily want me to get into the industry because they understood how difficult it is to be in the fashion industry, but I always wanted to approach fashion from an artist lens. And so going into college, I really tried to fight for that, which was very foreign to my instructors. They were more concerned about creating designers that could fit within the industry that already existed, and I very much wanted to build a better industry, because fashion, as most people probably know, has been historically linked to slavery, and even today 1 in 5 garments contain slave labor cotton. There's about 1.8 million people enslaved in a region in China. They're the Uyghurs. It's a minority group, and many of them, more than half of them, are forced to pick cotton, which ends up in all the clothing that we wear today. Nike, even the face masks that we wear probably contain this slave labor cotton. So myself is feeling like deeply empathetic and ethically driven. I couldn't allow myself to become complicit in being a cog that connects consumers to the support of slavery and other exploitive practices, let alone the environmental degradation caused by fashion. I really appreciate Roberta's focus on organic and sustainable dyeing, because that's super important. The chemical dyes used in the production of clothing today have just devastated estuaries and bodies of water across the world, and have really damaged environments where already impoverished people are living, and those are the people who are employed by the garment industry itself. So yeah, I came into the fashion school with a very different perspective than a lot of my classmates, and so I had to fight really hard to build the work that I wanted for the kind of career that I wanted. And in fashion school, I learned about a methodology called zero waste, WASTE. It's a practice which is actually really built on an ancient foundation of understanding a textile as a whole piece of material. And so when you design a zero waste pattern, you're thinking about every pattern piece slotting into the next, kind of like a giant puzzle, so that when you cut out the pattern pieces and assemble the garment, 100% of the original square or rectangle of fabric is present within that garment. Whereas with traditional manufacturing, if you think about the shape of a neckline, there's the positive shape of the scoop, but then there's that negative shape that just gets cut off and thrown away. So about 15% of textiles in manufacturing end up in landfills. And that's not even considering the amount of post-consumer waste that ends up in the landfills today. It's about 17 million tons annually that get trashed, and that's just, you know, clothing people no longer wear, clothing that gets stained, they're like, I can't fix it, just trash it. So anyways, the zero waste design methodology is very much focused about reducing the excessive textile waste that fast fashion has sort of navigated us towards today. And I found that to be very much, it resonated with my ethical standpoint and my design philosophy. I too, as Roberta said, am inspired by materials. I've never been good at just like drawing a picture and then manifesting it in the 3D. I'm more about the process and allowing the process to navigate the aesthetic of the final garment. And the aesthetic is ultimately determined by the way the pattern comes together, kind of for better or worse. Sometimes I make things I really hate, and that just gives you motivation to keep working into it until you find a place where you're like, oh, maybe I like you now. So I became very dedicated to zero waste, and that's really what I've built my creative foundation upon. But it extends beyond that. As you can see, the work that I'm doing here is both a fusion of fashion and furniture, which ends up kind of living in a world of sculpture. And after graduating, I came back to Seattle and ended up getting a job with a local artist who is a weaver. He weaves chairs, and so for like 8 years, I was weaving Danish, wicker, cane, all kinds of different chairs. And so from him, I learned a lot of techniques of chair weaving, and I've always been a knitter as well. And so when I came to start to develop this work, a lot of these different worlds and ideas and practices began to fuse. So to speak specifically about the work that I have present, both of these chairs started out as found chairs. I found this chair frame down the street from my studio, and this one I actually had to look online for a really long time to find the kind of chair frame that I needed. And originally this one actually had a wooden seat and back that screwed on, so when I bought it, I unscrewed those and then threw the wood in the wood pile for my neighbor, because he likes to have bonfires. And so once I get the chairs prepped and clean, then I warp up with, these are just different clothes and textile scraps. I've had a lot of people on Instagram DM me and be like, hey, I'm moving, do you want a bag of my old clothes? And I'll be like, send me some pictures, we'll see if I can work with it. And then they'll send me photos and I'm like, oh, I hate all of this, I don't want it. And then I'll be like, yeah, I'll take it. Because, you know, if it ends up at the Goodwill, chances are it's not going to live a very good life. It could end up in a textile recycling factory, which could be useful, but I feel like in part it's my duty to try to provide these like useless and just, I mean, sometimes just heinous things. Not that like the aesthetic of it is heinous, but it's, you know, it's like polyester, or it's like a clapped out yoga pants, like you can't wear those anymore, the knees are baggy, and or it's like pilling and just the quality is low, and so it's like, okay, what do we do? This thing exists. I feel like that's a big part of my philosophy as well. It's just like all this stuff exists and you can't deny that it exists. So how do we recontextualize it so that its existence can have some benefit to us all, as opposed to being just like a detriment to our society and destroying the planet even more than we already are. So yeah, I end up just with a lot of random clothing and textile scraps. And my design practice for when I'm making clothing, if I start with a full garment, I try to use that entire garment within, not necessarily that specific piece that I'm making, but within that collection, so that both with the zero waste pattern drafting and the zero waste upcycling, everything's accounted for. So I end up with very, very little waste, aside from seams. I have to cut out a lot of seams from garments. And so those seams end up, I'm trying to get to one, I see it in here. Those seams end up in here. Like this one is a seam from a sweater, and this is a seam from a men's button-up. So I save all those scraps and cut them into strips, or I've had some interns recently that I make do this work, and I feel really bad about it, but if you're gonna be an artist, you have to do a lot of repetitive, mundane, like just brain bleeding things. So I try to teach them that and then tell them to get a different job. Don't do it. Yeah, so I just sew them all together, and my technique is that I'll sew this stitch and then I'll pivot the next one around and line it up and sew that, and then pivot the next one and sew it. So I'm never cutting in between the stitches. I've just back stitching and get this one long stitch going, and then when I'm done, I cut them all out and they unravel, and then I roll them up into balls, and it's all kinds of stuff. Like this was a cover for a sewing machine, like a plastic fitted cover, and this is a great example of something nasty someone gave me. It was this polar fleece, but it was kind of like sticky and pilly, and yeah, it was just bad. But it ends up looking really beautiful. I actually don't know if anything ended up in here. But yeah, so it begins with that. There's a lot of labor of the cutting and the sewing and the wrapping and the prepping, and then you've got all your yarn, and then you're ready to weave. And so I warp up the weave, and with this, with both of these chairs actually, I weave across the front, and then I have to flip it over, and then I weave across the bottom. And the bottom obviously is about stability, but it's not as much about aesthetics, so I do longer passes on the bottom, but on the top I try to keep that standard basket weave of every other. And if you look close at this one, I found these pair of leather pants in a free box, and so there's little strips of that, there's some strips of a tarp, there's an old Letterman's jacket that I wore for a while, but it got really ragged, so I cut that all up. And there's some elastic here from a project that was failed, and these are my aunt's curtains that she unloaded onto me. And there's some like cord and just all kinds of things end up, and I do try with a piece like this to consider the colors and sort of the rhythm. Sometimes I'll tear off my thread and pull a different thing in so that I get like a nice pop of color in different places, because I want it to be bright and lively, but I also think it's nicely grounded by having the mixture of like neutrals and blacks and whites, but I don't want it to be overwhelmed by those neutral colors, as opposed to this one. This one's actually made with factory scraps from Prairie Underground, if you're familiar with that brand. It's local, based in Georgetown. They do all organic, sustainable clothing. And so I'm friends with the folks who own it, and over the years they've given me a lot of materials, and so these are offcuts from some of their patterns. So it's mostly linen and cotton. I've gotten a lot of jersey from them as well, which might have ended up in the sweater. But once I get the chair all woven, and like this one I had to weave the back separately, and this one too, the back is even woven all the way up, just some faux fur right here. So I get the chair all woven, and then I work on the sweater, and so that's a whole separate process. And this is just an example. I've got another chair that I'm working on. This is part of the sweater that I'm developing. And this one I'm just knitting it, I'm not purling. This one I did both knit and purl, so you get a bit of a different stitch. This one's just knit, and so that's why you get kind of those stripes, as opposed to this one, which has got the V pattern in it. And I don't really have any reasoning for why I chose one or the other. It's just like, it was faster to just knit this one. And this one I started as a knit purl, but I don't use patterns when I knit these sweaters. I just sort of like choose a number and take myself as far as I need to go, and so sometimes things turn out well and sometimes they don't. This is an example of when it didn't turn out well. The neck ended up being really broad, so when you put the sweater on, it just kind of fell off your shoulders. So I had to come back in and knit like a turtleneck so that when you put it on, it actually fits somewhat well, but I ended up really liking that aesthetic because it created more of the cocoon effect of it. So I think both of these chairs sort of have different functions, and they both get into more of the psychology of my work. I was feeling really like chronically overworked maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I still do, but in a different way. But I was working 4 jobs. I was like trying to maintain my life, and I'm married, and like have friends and keep my activities up, and also build sort of like 2 different creative careers simultaneously. And I was like, I just can't keep doing this. And so I started a project to try to resolve that dilemma. And initially what it was, because I needed a place to rest, and I like couldn't find that, because even something that's supposed to be restful like yoga just felt like an obligation and sort of like a requirement as opposed to a respite. And so I was like, oh, I'm gonna create a piece that can help me rest. And so my first piece, sort of in this long series of ideas, was a woven rug that had pants incorporated into it. So when you put on the pants, you're in the rug, and you like have to lay down or just stay seated. And if you get up, like you look really ridiculous, and the rug is so heavy it like kind of pulls the pants down. So there was this very radical idea of creating a demanding space for rest, because I felt like that's what I really needed. And so these chairs are another offshoot of that idea. I can demo both of them, but I'll do this one first because it worked out so that I can both wear it seated and standing. So it has a little bit of a different idea, but when you sit down, you have to get yourself into the neck and then put the 2 sleeves on. And so, sorry. Yeah, the sweater itself is very heavy because of the materials, and the gauge of the needle that I use is very big. So you can just stay seated here and feel that like a weighted blanket, you know, it's kind of calming. And if there was some like groovy music going, I feel like it could be a really nice space. But this one is fun. It's hard to stand up in, but you can actually like walk around. For someone my height, this one works out well. If you're taller too, if you're shorter, it's a bit harder. But yeah, you can like go for a walk with this chair on, and then if you end up in a line somewhere and you're like, I don't want to stand, then you can just sit down very gracefully. Take a break here. So that's this one.
That's so cool. I have a question.
Yeah.
So the pattern in that one in particular, I mean, it really does have a rhythm to it. It looks like it was planned.
Yeah, it's total happenstance.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, look at where the black, so you're not very often bringing in black or to...
It just depends. Like I'm very specific about how I build my yarn. I try to keep a rhythm when I'm sewing my yarn, so that I have that sort of like black, white, neutral, bright kind of rhythm. But it doesn't always match up when you've warped with one ball of yarn and then you're weaving with another. Sometimes you can end up in a moment where there's like, oh, there's so much black right here, or there's so much neutral. So that's when I'll have to break it off and like bring a bright color in.
I'm not sure I quite understood how you were making the yarn. So you say you take a big piece and you sew it, you're sewing it this way, and then you cut the strips?
No, so I cut strips of fabric.
Okay.
So I've just got this big bucket of strips of fabric. So I dig in there and I pull out a strip and I put it on my sewing machine, and then I layer another strip over it and I sew through it. And then I take another strip, and I was just demonstrating that instead of like sewing one, cutting it off, bringing it forward, sewing another, I create kind of this chain as I sew it so that it's faster. Because a lot of my skill is based on speed. In second grade, the only thing I remember my teacher saying, because I went to like a homeschool co-op, but the one comment that I remember her telling my parents at our like annual parent-teacher meeting was, she's very fast. So yeah, I'm always looking for like, what's the fastest way to do it? And I think that's part of why I really love incorporating happenstance into my work, because I don't want to take a really long time sitting and articulating on some decision that's ultimately not going to matter, because in the end I find it more exciting to come across an idea in the process as opposed to over intellectualizing it and then coming up with an idea that in the end feels subpar to me, because it's like I could have always come up with a better idea. But if you're just accepting like what is, to me it feels more exciting because it opens up new ideas. And that's really how the zero waste pattern drafting process goes too, because sometimes I'll cut out a pattern and start putting it together and it won't work at all. And that gives me the opportunity to make some new decisions and take it in a different direction and end up creating something I never would have planned or expected. But I get to enjoy it because it's that process of discovery as opposed to being more about prescription. Yeah, so this chair is a little harder to stand up in, and in some ways it's a little more difficult to get into, partially because of the neck. And it's got really big sleeves, like bigger than my arms. A very tall person would fit well in this, but I think those big sleeves really help this one to be like, don't do anything. If you're in this chair, because you're like swallowed up by the sweater, and this one, because the sweater is so big, I can't go on a walk with it. It drags quite a bit, but someone taller would be able to. So, yeah. Yeah, and once I get the chair woven and the sweater created, I just hand sew the sweater on to the back, and then I wrap all the bars, kind of like that friendship bracelet wrapping method. I'm sure it has a formal name, but and even with that, I try to be really intentional about just keeping like a nice consistency of bright colors incorporated within it, because most people's wardrobes are neutrals, blacks and whites. So when I get a lot of donated clothes, I end up with a lot of that material. But when I make clothing in my other art form, I do a lot of painting and dyeing, and I try to find ways to abstract all of the neutrality. So yeah, that's pretty much the work that I do. I hope these could live in someone's home and like serve a purpose for people who really need that like radical intervention of rest. That's how it feels for me at least. But my one struggle right now is finding the right kinds of chair frames. I'm always on Craigslist looking, just like out riding my bike, spotting them. I have this really big backpack, and so recently I picked up a chair and I was able to strap it onto my backpack and then ride to my studio, which I always hope someone's like filming me because it's quite a spectacle. But that's another aspect of like trying to be very low impact. I do have a car now, but I choose not to drive it, or I choose to drive it as little as possible and as much as I can, just like haul things where I need to go and travel by bike. Yeah.
So the chair frames that you buy, do they not have a seat or a back? It's just the frame and then you fill it in with the fabric and the textile?
Yeah, this one when I found it, I believe it didn't have a seat on it. But originally it would have had a seat that just screwed on. This one, when I bought it, it did have a wooden seat and back, but I could tell from the photos that if I took those off, I'd be able to weave on it. Because what I really, the thing that I find hardest to find is a back that doesn't have a bunch of like distracting lines. My neighbor is a welder, so I probably could get him to like saw stuff off for me, but when you end up then with those raw edges, it can cut into, your weave. And so, I'm really looking for frames that are just open and clear. And then again, don't have a lot going on the legs either. This one did have quite a bit of additional structure, but I just accepted how it ended up looking in the end. Like, you do all the work that you need to make it look cohesive and coherent. But I found 2 or 3 new chair frames recently. But my studio is only so big, so with this work, it's kind of like I'm gonna have to cut myself off unless my mom like lets me stash them in her garage. Because my apartment's not very big either. So for the most part, the work I invest in is my fashion work. But this is a great partner to that because of how much material I have coming through my space. And how it needs a purpose. And I enjoy it. It's a nice having that balance of multiple projects going on simultaneously. If I get overwhelmed with one, I can just take a break and start working on another. And yeah, having the knitting around too it's another aspect of that restfulness. You know, even though there is action in it and there's intention, it's still like a seated, calming activity to sort of distract from the rest of life. Yeah. Yeah. If there's any other questions, otherwise, I think that's all I have to say.
Somewhere that you do wardrobe therapy, what does that entail? And do you just take their clothes and turn them into something else, or do you?
Yeah, so wardrobe therapy is a fashion practice I have where I work directly with private clients, and it begins with an interview about their relationship to clothing and sort of like their earliest memories and how their style evolved over times and like what influenced them, especially in their teenage years, like music, media, friends, social groups. So once we kind of break all that down, as well as their shopping habits, like when they shop, why they shop, where they shop, then we look at garments that I usually try to have them select like 5-10 garments that they really love, but they don't wear, but they can't get rid of. And it doesn't even have to be stuff that they've worn before. Sometimes I'm sure everyone has like bought a thing because they liked it and then hung it on the like rack and never looked at it again. Or you see it in the closet and it's like, oh, I love that's in my closet, but I'm not gonna put it on my body. Sometimes people bring stuff like that. So yeah, we go through those pieces and kind of figure out like, what do you love about the piece? What do you hate about it? And we try to boil it down to like 3 to 5 garments that are worth salvaging. And sometimes they're not, because it's like, I love how it looks, but I hate how the garment feels, like the quality of the fabric. I don't like the feeling on my body. And I'm like, that's the one issue that we can't resolve. Like if you don't like the way the fabric feels, there's no way you're gonna ever wear something made out of that fabric. So we try to be intentional about the garments that we use, but then with the client, I try to design pieces that are created from the garments from their wardrobe. So it'll be, this sort of amalgamation of multiple pieces to become something new. And so I usually try to engage the client in that process because I don't want to make something they're not going to wear. I really want them to advocate for like what they need in their wardrobe, or if they have a vision about what something could become. So once that interview process is done, then I take it back to my studio and I take before images and I take the garments apart and sew them together, and then I have a fitting with the client just to make sure we're going in the right direction. And then when the pieces are completing, we do a final photo shoot, and I post on Instagram the before and after. So it's a way to prevent textile waste, to salvage like sentimental and emotionally valuable pieces that could otherwise either just be burdensome or get lost like without resolve. And I really enjoy the challenge of always trying to design for different aesthetics. So it's not about prescription, it's about affirmation. And so I'm not designing something I would wear or even want to make. I've made a lot of things that I don't like, but the client likes it and it fits in with the ethos of what I'm doing. And so that's the service that I provide. And it's zero waste too, so I use 100% of the original garment. And in that case, with the scraps and seams, I'll sew them into a little bag or knit or weave them into something. There's always kind of like a little bonus bauble that comes with it. But yeah, I've been doing that for about three or 4 years now, and I have a wait list because it's very intensive and I can only do so many. I do like 3 clients a month, if that. So I think my next opening is like in a year. Which feels great. But recently a lot of people have had to cancel because of COVID, like everybody's broke or they moved. Though I have been able to do it fully remotely with people. But yeah, that's wardrobe therapy. Mm-hmm.
That's really expensive.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's a lot of different stuff going on trying to manage. But it's all really built on the same foundation of just like, it might be garbage now, but it could be something even better later. It helps me process my anxiety. Yeah.
It's very inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your questions.
Be sure not to miss the Fresh Talent exhibition featuring 30 regional artists, all of them new to the gallery, at Bainbridge Arts and Crafts from October 1st through October 31st.